Emily Carter noticed the wooden stakes early that morning, sharp and fresh in the soil along the edge of her backyard. And the sight stopped her mid-step as if the quiet weekend had suddenly shifted its tone, because that line of stakes meant change, and change had not been gentle with her in recent years. Not since life had taught her how quickly familiar things could disappear. And as she stood there with the cool air brushing her face, she realized the open stretch of grass she had always seen as shared space was about to be divided without a single conversation, which stirred a mix of confusion and unease she could not easily name. And while she knew she had no right to control what happened on land that was not hers, the silence behind the decision felt heavier than the fence itself, especially since the man who lived next door was still mostly a stranger. Someone she only knew through passing glances and polite nods. A man named Marcus Hill, tall, quiet, always moving with purpose. Someone who seemed calm but distant, as if he carried his world neatly inside himself and rarely let it spill out. And now here he was, kneeling near the boundary line with a measuring tape in hand, focused and serious, treating the ground with care, though each inch mattered. And Emily hesitated for a long moment before stepping closer, because something in her needed answers even if her voice shook. And when she finally spoke, her greeting came out softer than she intended. Not angry, not accusing, just curious and slightly wounded. And Marcus looked up, clearly surprised, his expression shifting quickly into a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and when he explained the fence in simple words, saying he wanted clear boundaries and peace of mind, Emily nodded, even though the word boundaries echoed sharply in her chest, because she understood it too well. Having built invisible ones around herself since losing her husband, walls that kept the world at a safe distance, yet hearing it spoken aloud made it feel final, like a door gently closing. And as Marcus returned to his work and Emily walked back toward her house, the yard suddenly felt smaller, the silence heavier, and her thoughts moved faster than she could control. Wondering why this simple fence mattered so much, wondering why she cared, wondering what she had hoped for from a neighbor she barely knew. And as the day moved on, she tried to distract herself with chores, with emails, with half-finished plans. But her eyes kept drifting toward the window, toward the quiet line being drawn just outside. And later, when she saw Marcus struggling with uneven ground and stubborn roots, she felt an unexpected pull to help, not because he needed it, but because she needed a reason to cross that invisible line before it hardened into something permanent. And when she stepped outside again, offering a small comment, a simple question, the tension eased just enough for a brief exchange that felt honest, almost fragile, and in those few minutes, she learned he was new to the area, that he had moved from the city seeking calm. That starting over was harder than he expected, and without meaning to. Emily shared pieces of her own story, not the details. Just the weight of loss and how quiet the house could feel. And Marcus listened, truly listened, with a stillness that made her feel seen rather than pitied. And as the sun dipped lower, painting the yard in warm colors, the fence no longer felt like an act of separation, but a beginning. It's a reason they were standing there talking instead of passing like strangers. And when they finally parted, there was no dramatic moment. No promise, just a shared pause. A look that lingered a second longer than necessary. And as Emily closed her back door, her heart beat faster than it had in years. Not from fear, but from something close to hope. Because she realized the fence had done something unexpected. It had forced her to speak, to step forward, to feel again. And while she did not yet know what this neighbor would mean to her life, she sensed that this simple act, this quiet line in the ground, had already changed the direction of her days. And as night settled in, the unfinished fence stood between their yards like a question waiting to be answered, promising that what began with wood and boundaries might not end the way either of them expected. Asterisk, the fence did not rise all at once. And in the days that followed, the empty space between Emily Carter and Marcus Hill began to feel less like a border and more like a meeting point. Because Marcus worked in small, careful steps, arriving in the late afternoons after work and leaving just before dark, and Emily found herself noticing his routine without meaning to. The way he set his tools down neatly, the way he paused to study the ground as if listening to it, and one evening, when the sky darkened suddenly and rain rolled in without warning, Emily saw him scrambling to protect his equipment, and without stopping to think, she grabbed an old tarp from her garage and ran outside, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp grass as she called out to him. And Marcus looked up with surprise before breaking into a genuine laugh, the kind that loosened something between them. And as they worked together to cover the tools, the rain forcing them close, but not uncomfortable, their conversation began. Naturally, moving quickly past small talk into shared truths. And Marcus spoke about leaving Chicago behind, about wanting a quieter life after years of noise and pressure, about how starting over felt both freeing and lonely. And Emily listened, recognizing the mix of hope and fear in his words. And when she spoke about her own life, about how the house still held memories she was learning to live with rather than escape, Marcus did not rush her or change the subject. He simply stayed present, and that simple attention made the moment feel heavier and warmer at the same time. And over the next several days, these brief conversations became a pattern. Small moments at the edge of the yard where they talked about work, about favorite meals, about the strange comfort of routines. And the fence itself slowly transformed, from a symbol of separation into an excuse to pause and connect. And Emily noticed how her days felt brighter, how she looked forward to those short exchanges, how laughter came easier than it had in years. And Marcus, though still reserved, began to open up in subtle ways, sharing his doubts, his quiet goals, his habit of keeping distance even when he did not want to. And Emily sensed that the fence was not the only thing he had built to protect himself. And one evening, as the sun set low and painted the sky in soft orange light, the conversation drifted back to the fence. And Marcus admitted that he had worried it might seem cold or unfriendly, that he had built it out of habit rather than intention. And Emily surprised herself by telling him she understood, that she too had learned to draw lines after being hurt. And in that shared understanding, something shifted. Something unspoken but powerful, because they both realized they were standing on opposite sides of more than just wood and nails. And yet neither felt truly apart, and as days turned into weeks, the fence took shape piece by piece, but so did their connection, growing stronger through small acts, shared jokes, quiet glances, the kind of trust that forms not from grand gestures, but from consistency. And Emily found herself opening windows in the evening just to hear the sounds of Marcus working outside, while Marcus lingered longer than necessary near the fence, hoping she might step out again, and neither of them named what was happening. It's because naming it would make it real and risk breaking its fragile balance. And yet the feeling remained steady and undeniable. And when the final boards were placed and the fence stood complete, both of them felt a strange mix of satisfaction and loss, because the project that had brought them together was ending. And as Marcus wiped his hands clean and stepped back to admire his work, Emily leaned against the fence, smiling but feeling a quiet ache, knowing that this simple structure had changed her days in ways she had not expected. And as they stood there in comfortable silence, the fence between them solid but no longer threatening, Emily realized that sometimes walls did not push people away. Sometimes they revealed how much someone mattered. And Marcus, looking at her across the polished wood, felt the same understanding that what had begun as a need for distance had become the very reason he no longer wanted it. And as night fell and they finally said goodnight, neither of them knew where this path would lead. But both sensed that the space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with possibility, waiting quietly for its next turn. When the fence was finally complete, Emily Carter expected a sense of relief, a neat line that would mark the end of uncertainty. But instead she felt a strange emptiness, as if the very act of separation had revealed something she hadn't noticed before, because in the weeks leading up to its completion, the fence had become more than wood, and nails it had been an excuse to see Marcus, to share moments, to laugh and talk without the pressure of formality. And now that the board stood straight and strong, the quiet ache of missing him settled into her chest, sharper than she expected, because distance, even the smallest, suddenly, felt more tangible, more permanent, and yet life continued around them. Neighbors moving in and out, cars passing, the sun rising and falling, while Marcus' absence, even for a single evening, was impossible to ignore. And Emily found herself watching, waiting, hoping, till the day came when he didn't appear at all. And the stillness of the yard mirrored the tension inside her. A knot of concern she could not untangle, because she had grown used to those small, ordinary interactions at the fence, the simple rhythm of conversation and shared space. And when days passed without him stepping outside, she tried to convince herself it was nothing. A busy schedule, rain, work, anything but her mind would not be quiet, running through possibilities, imagining reasons, each more unlikely and yet somehow plausible, until finally she saw him loading boxes into his truck. And the sight hit her like a sudden winter chill, the realization that he was leaving, truly leaving, bringing a heaviness she had not expected. And as she stepped closer, words trembling in her throat, she tried to mask the worry with casual tones, asking if he was moving far, if the new job in Seattle was really what he wanted. And Marcus paused, setting a box down carefully, looking at her with a gaze that held unspoken words, emotions neither ready to name. And as he spoke quietly about the opportunity, about the chance for growth and change, Emily nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, because inside she felt the slow crumbling of something delicate, something that had grown quietly over time between them. And as she stood there, the fence looming between them like a silent observer, she realized it had done its job, protecting space, defining lines, yet failing entirely to stop hearts from leaning toward one another. And Marcus's words carried weight she hadn't anticipated. The subtle admission that he had built the fence to feel secure, but found himself wanting to tear it down, to close the distance he had just defined. And Emily's breath caught, the air between them heavy with what could not be said openly. And for a fleeting moment, time itself seemed to pause, holding on to the tension, the longing, the quiet regret of opportunities slipping away, because neither wanted to speak what they felt, yet both felt it strongly, palpably, like a pulse beneath the wood, beneath the lines of separation. And when the truck door closed, signaling his departure, Emily felt an ache that was both sudden and lingering, a hollow that could not be filled by routine or distraction. And she returned inside, trying to breathe, trying to convince herself that distance could not undo what had grown, but knowing deep down that absence was sharper than presence, that leaving behind the fence and the conversations and the laughter was like leaving a piece of herself in the yard. And as she walked through the quiet house, every sound seemed amplified, every shadow stretching longer than before, reflecting the space that had opened up between her and Marcus, yet also highlighting the connection that had quietly formed, strong enough to persist even across miles, even across unspoken words. And that night, she found herself staring out the window at the fence, tracing the lines with her eyes as if she could will him back. And in that stillness, she understood that the fence, once a boundary meant to protect, had instead revealed the depth of her longing, the fragile, unexpected attachment she had tried to ignore. And she realized that some separations, physical or emotional, cannot erase the moments shared, the laughter, the confessions, the comfort of being seen without judgment. And as the stars began to appear, delicate and distant, Emily allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had tried to avoid, that losing Marcus from her everyday view felt like losing more than a neighbor. It felt like losing a friend, a confidant, a presence that had quietly brightened her days. And she understood that boundaries could define space, but they could never control the heart, could never stop connection when it chose to grow. And while she felt the sharp sting of departure, there was also a strange warmth, a hope that perhaps what had begun by the fence was not over. That distance might challenge them, test them, but could not erase what had been built in moments of laughter, shared stories, and unspoken understanding. And as she finally closed the curtains and moved through the dimly lit house, she promised herself she would not let the ache fade into forgetfulness, that she would remember the way Marcus had listened, the way he had cared, the way the fence had become a doorway instead of a wall. And she knew, deep down, that some endings were only beginnings in disguise, waiting for the courage to turn into something new, something unexpected, something that neither distance nor boards could truly define. On Marcus's last morning, Emily Carter woke earlier than usual, the sunlight spilling softly across her bedroom floor, and for some reason, she didn't want to stay inside any longer. She needed to see him, to speak before the distance became permanent, because the days since learning he was leaving had been heavy with unspoken words, small regrets, and the ache of realizing how much his presence had come to mean. And as she stepped outside, the air crisp with early morning calm, her eyes immediately found him at the edge of the yard, checking the truck one last time, and she felt her chest tighten, a mix of fear and hope. Fear of losing what had quietly grown between them, and hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the morning offered one last chance, and without hesitation she approached the fence, running her hand along the smooth wood as if drawing strength from its familiar texture. And when Marcus looked up, surprise flickered across his face before it was replaced with that calm, warm expression she had come to recognize, and she didn't pause, didn't step back. She simply said what had been on her mind, her voice steady but soft. "I don't want the fence gone, but I don't want this to end either." And Marcus blinked, absorbing her words, as if they were both a question and an answer, and for a moment the world held still, the hum of the morning fading around them, leaving just the two of them, and the fence that had both separated and connected them. And then he smiled, slow and genuine, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and warmed Emily from the inside out. And he replied quietly, "Then let's not end it. Let's just start slower." And the simplicity of the words struck her, because in that gentle phrasing was permission, understanding, and the possibility of something new. Something neither of them had expected when the fence was first placed between their yards, and they spent the next few minutes talking. Not about goodbyes or plans, but about small things, about staying in touch, about meeting occasionally and letting the connection grow naturally without forcing it. And in that exchange, Emily realized how much courage it took to step forward, to admit feelings without naming them fully, and Marcus revealed the same. Bravery in his careful attention, in his willingness to leave space for her words and to offer honesty in return. And as the truck finally pulled away, loaded with boxes and with the distance that had loomed over them now tangible, Emily felt an unexpected calm. Not emptiness, because they had both chosen to continue, to acknowledge what had started instead of letting it fade quietly. And over the following weeks, phone calls came first. Simple conversations that gradually grew longer, stories shared, jokes remembered, and small moments of laughter that felt like threads connecting them across miles. And visits followed, tentative at first, scheduled carefully, yet each one deepening the bond they had begun at the fence. And every time Marcus returned, Emily felt the same flutter, the same anticipation that had first drawn her outside, because, even in distance, their connection had grown stronger, and the fence that had once symbolized separation now existed merely as a marker. A reminder of how two lives can intersect unexpectedly, how boundaries can invite interaction rather than prevent it. And as months passed, their visits became more natural, more comfortable, filled with quiet moments of shared observation. of conversation that wandered from mundane to meaningful, and Emily often found herself smiling at the thought that what had started with a simple line in the ground had transformed into a journey neither had predicted, because the fence had forced them to see each other, to speak, to feel, and Marcus's presence in her life became not just comforting, but essential. A steady rhythm against the quiet of her home, and as he stayed longer each time, the emotional walls they had both built began to soften, replaced by trust, understanding, and the quiet thrill of mutual respect and affection. And Emily realized that love, in its gentlest form, often begins not with grand gestures, but with small, consistent acts like conversation at the edge of a yard, shared laughter in unexpected moments, the willingness to be present even when the world moves fast and harsh. And one evening, standing together at the fence, the sun casting long shadows across the lawn, Emily looked at Marcus and understood fully that the fence had never been a barrier. It had been a beginning, a space that allowed them to find each other slowly, carefully, honestly. And Marcus looked back with the same recognition in his eyes. A silent acknowledgement that neither distance nor time could erase what had taken root there. And as they leaned slightly against the wood, comfortable and unguarded, they both knew that the story of the fence was now a story of connection, of hearts reaching across the simplest of divides, and that sometimes what starts as separation takes a turn into something far deeper, far richer than anyone could plan. And as night fell softly over the neighborhood, Emily realized that the fence remained solid and quiet, but it no longer held meaning as a wall. It had become a witness to the beginning of something lasting, something that had been born from cautious steps, honest words, and the willingness to risk. And as they walked back into their homes, side by side yet separated by yards and boards, both hearts carried the same certainty that the unexpected turn the fence had created was exactly where they were meant to be, and that sometimes beginnings are hidden inside endings, waiting only for someone brave enough to reach across and start again.